sailing with the boat, sink or float, a sailing with the boat.
Through hurricane and storm, hell or high water come, and when she needs a push, I'm going to push like Bush. If Trinidad is a boat,
I go sail on it, sink or float.
And with that, we welcome you inside the afternoon drive time exchange right here on New Era TT Radio. If Trinidad is a boat, trust me, we on it, sink or float. Tony Fraser, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon to you, Charles. Most appropriately, a calypso for the times.
Yes.
Right. Okay, so I am a little bit disadvantaged for the moment. The power has gone in my area. It was supposed to come back at 4 p.m. We are past 4 and it's not back yet. So hopefully, I am on my phone. So hopefully it will come back soon enough so that I could be fully on the screen. But I trust, I've not even seen them. I trust our guests are there. We expect Dr. Dave Seerattan, who is an economist with the International Relations Institute at UWI, St. Augustine, and Dr. Vanus James of Tobago, and economists extraordinaire, talking about matters. What we are talking about this afternoon are the economic perils, as some people have put it, up ahead. And we're going to see how we are able to hear from the economists how are the best ways to navigate from here into a better place. Later on in the program at 5, just after 5, we're going to have 2 other economists joining us, Professor Roger Hussain of UWI and Gregory Maguire, energy specialist. So let's, our 2 guests there, Charlo, I can't see them on
Yes, they are. They are there. Both of them are there. Gentlemen, good afternoon to you.
Right. So, gentlemen, you've heard of my predicament. If it doesn't come on, you just go ahead and talk to each other if my phone charge runs out. So it's a kind of a tricky kind of situation this afternoon.
Touch and go situation.
But hopefully, TNTech will keep it going.
Long time I haven't seen you, man.
Yeah, Dave. Yeah, how you doing?
I'm okay. You know, how are you doing?
Yeah, well, we have to hold it out for Tony.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
How is he doing, by the way?
Yeah, so gentlemen, let me start you all off on the journey. Let me start with Dr. Seerattan, who's a specialist in international economic matters at the Institute, as I said a moment ago. Looking at Dr. Seerattan, looking at how the international situation is shaping and the likely impacts on our economy in Trinidad and Tobago. What do you see up ahead as the challenges?
Well, to me, the our main challenges still remains what they were a year ago. The histrionics related to Mr. Trump's tariffs and so on aside. As you can see from what has happened recently, that is basically a negotiating mechanism to bring certain countries around in terms of their trade policy and so on. So I expect that those things will dissipate over time. So those things I don't think is going to have a material impact, a long-term impact on us. Our main problem basically has to do with our international competitiveness, and in particular, our very high dependence on the energy sector, the challenges we face in that sector, and very, very importantly, as the Prime Minister was referring to recently, our fiscal challenges. Those are the main challenges that we face. So on the energy industry side, I mean to say that there's no substitute to finding or gas, because that is what drives our economy. And there have been recently some positive developments on that front, with one of our explorers hitting some gas in the tank. But it is going to take a very, very lot of exploration and proving up our reserves to fill that gap. But in the interim, we have to find a way to deal with the fiscal challenge that we have. And I think that is one of the main things that the new Minister of Finance has to deal with. The Prime Minister, after the post cabinet presser, was outlining the situation in which we find ourselves. And of course, she talked about the ways in which they were going to plug the gap by running down the heritage and taking some money from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, refinancing treasury bills, borrowing some money, and using the overdraft facilities at the central bank, which, as a matter of fact, is what the last government was doing. Because you remember, if I had to point out this recently on another program that I was on, that we have been having these challenges in terms of our fiscal challenges since 2012, right? That is when essentially and particularly after 2014, when energy prices declined significantly. That was the end of the commodity super cycle, essentially. And basically, our revenues from the energy sector dropped by a half. So it moved from, I think, if my memory serves me correct, about $18 billion to about $9 billion, which is a shock that not many countries could navigate effectively, right? There is going to be some pain for now, and I often tell people that the fact that we have managed to kind of hold things together to this point is a minor miracle, given the level of the shock that we face since 2014 fundamentally, and that has spanned two different regimes, both of them encountering the same kinds of problems, both of them adopting the same kind of strategies to deal with the problem. But I think we need simply putting out fires and simply surviving is not the best way. We have to pivot, and we have to pivot very, very strongly. There are moves ahead in terms of diversification, particularly in the tourism industry. And Vanus is a good person to have on the thing, because Tobago is going to be the linchpin of those initiatives and so on. And so the development of the airport in Tobago is good. We need to invest a lot of money that we are spending now to build up the cruise port facility in Tobago. And very, very importantly, we need to do something about our tourism plant and equipment, because if you have gone to any of the hotels in Tobago, bar the new one in Scarborough, you could see the signs of decay. And if you really want to push very hard in the tourism area, because that is really the only sector that could make up significantly some of the foreign exchange earnings we have lost, you need to make an investment in the tourism plant and equipment. Whether you build new hotels or whether you refurbish the old ones, this is the main challenge. And I might add, this is not something that's peculiar to Trinidad and Tobago. Barbados was in the same position about 10 years ago, and the government of Barbados have made significant investment in the tourism plant and so on in Barbados. And now the private sector, the foreign private sector in particular, is coming in, and they're building new hotels and so on. But sometimes when things are not going your way, the government have to step in, and they have to find resources from somewhere to do what needs to be done in terms of building out the tourism plant and equipment in the tourism sector. If we have to make a serious attempt at diversification into that particular sector, then we have to spend some money, because you can't make headway in that arena without making some significant investment. The good thing is that Tobago is one of the, you should know, Tobago is one of the best place jurisdiction in the Caribbean in terms of the natural beauty of the place. In terms of the cost of living relative to Barbados and the Bahamas and so on, tourists might find that particular jurisdiction a little more affordable. But we have to do something about the airlift, and we have to do something about the tourism plant and equipment. And I'm sure Vanus might be much more knowledgeable about the kinds of things we need to do in those areas.
Okay, just to indicate that my power is back, but I still have to make some arrangements. So I want you to continue after Dr. James's opening statement on the issue of while we have to wait for some revenue streams to come in, how are we going to deal with the immediate situation? Dr. Seerattan talked about drawing down on some of the funds, HSF, and the last time the NGC was a source of funding for several governments over the period of time. But what are the immediate possibilities? But this is after Dr. James has had it say. Meanwhile, I transfer to my regular computer. So you take it on from there.
Well, I think the general issue that the country has to grapple with now is the broad-based character of the crisis we have experienced sharp economic decline since 2015 for sure. In those 9 years, our economy from 2015 to 2023, the economy collapsed by about 22% in real GDP per capita terms. And I might add the same thing happened in Tobago, a basic 23% decline, continuing under the Farley government as well. And the outlook to get out of that from here isn't rosy. I spent the morning, I took some time this morning to look at a couple of pieces of data that might help to set this stage for the discussion here. In the oil market, the oil prices declined. They're on a downward trend. They are now at about $61.68 per barrel. And that's about 21% below the forecast of $78 used in the 2024-2025 fiscal year budget. And I looked at the futures up to September. They're heading down to $60. And I picked up a Goldman Sachs report predicting that if Donald Trump gets his way on oil prices, the prices are heading for the $40 to $50 range. So this is not so inconsequential as you might be suggesting there, Dave, because if, for example, he gets to make the kind of deal he wants to make with Iran, that will bring a huge pool of oil into the market that would drive down the prices. Those are oils that are now not in the market because of US sanctions. But if you free up Iran, that I think is the third largest industry in the global space, and that would wreak havoc with oil prices. So that's Trump's tariffs may not cause us as much trouble as Trump's geopolitics. That's not something we could sneeze at, given where we are trying to make money, how we're trying to make money with the remnants of Petrotrin, exporting what little barrels of crude we can produce. The other thing to notice too is that the data on the gas prices today are not encouraging. They are at about $3.43 per MMBTU. That's about 4% below the budgeted target of $3.59 that was set by co-member for the 2024-2025 budget. And even though the gas futures themselves look much brighter than the oil futures, the country's gas prospects don't look good because of the state of the Dragon deal, the limited prospects for serious solutions coming from Grenada or Guyana or Suriname, which all the informed observers are pointing out. If you're counting on gas coming from Guyana or Suriname, you have to grapple with Venezuela still, because of where Venezuela sits between Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana. So the economic prospects that the country faces on the historical industrial strategy that we have followed do not look good, and they spell significant budget deficits in 2025-26 and in the near future, actually, going into 27, 28, all the way up to 30. I think this government will have almost as rough a time, if not a rougher time, than it had when it first came in 2010. So the country has to think a little bit about what the options for raising revenues are. I'm not encouraged by the decision of the government to scrap the TTRA without working through proper solutions that will encourage people who owe taxes to pay up. But that's for a different part of the conversation. I think under the circumstances, I think the advice that I read today from the central bank in its May public education series report is very interesting and very good for the country to consider. That report is entitled Trinidad and Tobago's Relationship with the World Bank. And what the central bank is summarily proposing is that the country needs to look at exploiting all the possibilities for large-scale borrowing from the World Bank. Up until now, we have not been able to borrow significantly from the World Bank because of the high income classification that the country has under the World Bank's classification system. But the World Bank is offering some prospects for reclassification, well, at least treatment of bringing borrowing options to countries that are high income, in the high income group. And what they're talking about here is deploying the resources. I might point out that Trinidad and Tobago is still in the high income group of the World Bank classification, but what the World Bank is offering is some prospect to use its multilateral investment guarantee agency to create access to loans that are intended to support the attraction of foreign direct investment. And of course, they also provide insurance and related schemes to support that effort. And I think that's something the country needs to pay a lot of attention to. The reason that is so attractive, I think, right now is that economists like Dave and others have been complaining for a long time that the country needs to diversify. And all of Dave's opening statement here on this show points to his continuing belief that we have to do something quickly about diversification. He is pointing to tourism, Tobago style. I have a different opinion on that myself, but the broad principle of cleaning up the diversification of the economy has a meaning that has a lot to do with what the World Bank is offering. If you're going to go down the road of diversification for Trinidad and Tobago, you have to think about identifying and exploiting the comparative advantages of the economy. There are industries in the country that bring substantial comparative advantage beyond what oil and gas offers. And if you go into exploiting those, they promise both higher wages and higher profits. That's what attracts foreign direct investment. And that's what allows you to go to the World Bank with a clear case that there are these options, these industries into which we could push our heads, and they could bring some of their large-scale financing support to help us to do that work. So I think that's good advice from the central bank. It's written in very subtle, very sensitive language, but I think it's technically sound and quite timely.
Right.
Why I do,
Williams, sorry, just before you go on,
yes.
we talk about borrowing, that triggers from an international agency, that triggers all kinds of things in the minds of people outside there who must be wondering about the distinction or the differentiation between the borrowing from the IMF with all its stipulations, and of course borrowing from a longer term lender, which is the World Bank. Will those, if there is lending, project lending, will they come with stipulations that can impact the public sector?
Well, all international lenders, even though modest ones like our own Caribbean Development Bank and the IDB and so on, bring some conditionalities when they lend to governments. And the World Bank is no different. And it has significant conditionalities itself. It will tend to want appropriate budgetary strategies that will allow it to see that the country could repay whatever loan it brings. And it normally does its lending in some consultation with the IMF too. Don't forget that the World Bank and the IMF is the famous, these are the famous partners of the Washington Consensus. So they work together. So there will be no access to World Bank facilities that are without conditionality. But the World Bank is nowhere near the IMF in terms of its interest in reducing the standard of living of the country to ensure that loans can be repaid and so on.
There's a longer time of repayment for the loans because they are development in nature.
Yeah, that's right. And the terms are generally quite modest. I mean, you're talking development loans here in the very low concessional rate range. And I think the World Bank loans will be well below what both the CDB and the IDB would be able to offer. I've worked in major projects funded by the World Bank. They bring technical assistance along with whatever loans they build. And of course, a lot of what they have been doing in our own country is about offering technical assistance. So the World Bank has a pretty decent approach to lending that will be good for us. And all of this story about the insurance supports, the lending to support our ability as a small island state to grapple with the consequences of climate change and so on. All of those are things that will make it relatively easy to work out a decent package with the World Bank. Now, the point about all of this, though, Tony, is that you're talking about a country that has long needed diversification. It's been postponed by decades of policy making by the political parties, especially the PNM, I would say. And in the last 10 years, almost nothing has been done seriously to deal with diversification in the sense in which Dave is talking about it. I just wanted to make one last point before you take over. And that point is that tourism in the case of Tobago and Trinidad provides a platform on which you could exploit a lot of the industries in which we have significant comparative advantage. And if you look across the Caribbean space, you have a lot of evidence of what those industries are. And I'm currently doing some work with the UN on the Philippines, and you see a lot of evidence of very similar areas for comparative advantage that we can exploit. We have simply not bothered because of our obsession with oil and gas, but God has now proven many times to us that he or she is not a Trini, and therefore we have to take up our beds and walk, as Lloyd Bess used to say. So we have to talk seriously about the areas in which we have comparative advantage and get about the business of borrowing from agencies like the World Bank to get started down that road. So I'm particularly encouraged by the central bank's report, encouraging the government to look in that direction. Yeah, over to you, Tony.
Yeah. Sorry about that little intervention there. I want to come to I want to come to Dr. Seerattan with regard to the kind of wherever we get the funding from, we meaning the government of Trinidad and Tobago gets the funding from to meet the immediate needs, the non-developmental needs, meaning talking about tourism, development, etc., looking for more gas wherever. How are we going to handle that? Because we have not heard a statement, a direct statement on the state of the treasury just yet. Just a concern that taking revenue from the different places that the government has indicated it will come from so far, including, of course, carrying out its statement on the campaign that the revenue authority is a non-starter. Where will the funding come from? And if it doesn't go to a developmental purpose, that will probably create even more trouble for
different points that is difficult to impact, but I want to focus on the whole issue about revenue. On the revenue in the sense of fixing our fiscal problems in terms of the overall deficit, and revenue in the sense of getting money and investable resources that we could use to build out the diversification effort, particularly in the tourism sector. So Vanus would have raised the whole point about the World Bank. So that's really something for the external sector in terms of using resources that we could borrow to do the things we need to do on the in terms of investing in the tourism industry and so on. Now, I'm not so sure that we might be successful in getting significant amount of funds from the World Bank because, as Vanus rightly pointed out, that particular institution is constrained by who they could lend to and who they could lend the concessional funds to. And Trinidad and Tobago, as he indicated, is a very high income country. If you look at the average income and you look at the different profiles, Trinidad and Tobago, in spite of all the problems we face, is always going to be generally a high income country, right? So getting money from the World Bank might be very difficult. But there are all kinds of sources that we could get hard currency from to build out the tourism sector. The new Minister of Finance has recently been installed as the chair of CAF, right? Which is one institution that Trinidad and Tobago, even under the previous regime, have been borrowing money from. We have also borrowed a lot of money from the Inter-American Development Bank, which Vanus mentioned, right? And which may be at rates that are higher than what the World Bank can lend. But I still think that you could borrowing from the Inter-American Development Bank is good. And debt is not necessarily bad, you know. It depends on what the proceeds of debt is used for. In the past, we have used the proceeds of debt to do things and spend money in areas that are not directly related to growth, and in particularly not directly related to things the tradable sector where we can export and therefore earn income. So if you are borrowing money primarily to build out your tourism industry, and you know that there's a direct link between spending in the tourism sector and in future earnings of hard currency, not $80, hard currency, then if you are a Minister of Finance, that is something that you do because it depends. Borrowing could be helpful for growth and for diversification, depending on what you use the proceeds for. So if the new government is very, very determined and focused on building out the tourism sector, and you know all the proceeds we get from those loans, we are going to be investing in the tourism sector, whether we develop the cruise tourism infrastructure in Tobago, whether we have a program that methodology goes through very carefully, and every single Tobago hotel in Tobago, you go and upgrade it, and also in Trinidad, right? Then you know that that is something that is going to directly impact on your ability to earn income, and not only just income, hard currency, right? Which is something that we need, right? So in terms of the investment, the government obviously, I would not advise that we take money from our Heritage and Stabilization Fund or run down our reserves in order to use those proceeds to build out the tourism sector, because as Vanus would know, those funds that we have in the external reserves and in the Heritage and Stabilization Fund is really an insurance policy, right? And that should be the last thing that you turn to to get resources to do whatever you need to do.
Yeah, but
Right?
what I'm most concerned about at this point is that if the revenue comes in and the government seeks to spend it in the areas, wherever the revenue comes from, loans or what, well, coming from loans from an international agency, you can't very well spend that money on other matters. But if the revenue comes in from wherever, and we spend it on meeting campaign needs, we could be in trouble because we are getting ourselves into further debt without developmental spending.
No, well, Tony, you are correct. I mean to say one of the problems with that sustainability issues in the Caribbean is because government from Bahamas in the north to Suriname in the south have a lot of the money they have borrowed, they have not put to good use, and they have invested in areas where there is not a direct and commensurate link with your future ability to repay the debt. Right? So that's the point I make. And I mean to say, we could talk until the cows come home in terms of the responsibility of governments over the years, but they are the people in charge. And if they have a very, very clear focus on where they're going to use the borrowed funds to build out our capacity, then I mean to say, as you rightly indicated, when you borrow money from the Inter-American Development Bank for, say, infrastructural development in the tourism sector, you can't go and spend it on paying public servants salaries, right? Because remember, the funds are released in tranches, and there are different reports you have to do to show where you spend the money and so on. So in that respect as well, by having a development bank involved in the process, there's a certain oversight that you would not normally have if they got the money from taxes and so on, right? Because you have to justify to the development bank all the spending that you do. So in that respect as well, there is a certain level of control. So even if, I mean to say, you can't do anything if a government is determined to act in the wrong way, right? But I'm not. I personally don't think that this government is going to be acting in that way, right? So the point is, we have to trust the people we have elected. And if they say they're going to borrow money from the IDB or any other entity outside in order to build out the tourism sector, we have to hold them to that. But if we are borrowing money from places like the Inter-American Development and CAF, those development banks hold the borrowers to task and in terms of the areas they have said they're going to invest in money. So I am not too worried about that area. So that's one. Now, the second thing is in terms of financing on the domestic side, which deals primarily with the budget. And Vanus is completely correct. One of the things I'm a little worried about is the government's decision to basically do away with the Revenue Authority. Now, a lot of people think that the Revenue Authority was something that Mr. Imbert created, but if you have been looking at IMF Article 4 consultation report, for the entire Caribbean, this is something they have consistently been advocating and advising people to do, right? So what we need to do is to overhaul the administrative and governance process in place for collecting taxes and revenues and so on, right? Because we have in the Caribbean one of the lowest tax buoyancy rates in the whole of Latin America and the Caribbean and the world, right? And that is because, in a large part, because we don't have very, very good administrative systems for collecting tax. So even if you don't want to call it the Revenue Authority, there has to be a significant overhaul of our taxation regime, the administrative arrangement, right? Because one of the reasons we don't collect the right amount of taxes and so on, and why we have a problem with our fiscal balance is because there's a lot of leakages from the system, right? And I believe I would have referenced on another program as well. When Mr. Dukran was finance minister, during the first term of the People's Partnership, he had a series of programs where he gave people a certain amount of time to sort out the tax issues and so on. And at that time, he actually estimated, the people at the Ministry of Finance, I suppose with some help from the IMF and so on, that the amount of taxes that was not collected from people who they should have collected taxes from was between $6 and $8 billion. So if you have proper tax reform, you build out the administrative arrangements in place for tax collection, without raising the marginal tax, you could collect close to $6 billion at the low end, right? That is almost 80, 90% of our fiscal deficit. So without imposing new taxes on people, simply collecting taxes from the people who we suppose to be collecting taxes for, you're going to clear up a significant amount of our budget. But you know, people, the powers that be in some important places may not want the tax regime to be very efficient because then they will have to pay their fair share, right? So that is something that if the government is serious about dealing with our fiscal balance in terms of closing that fiscal balance and not have to worry about taking money out of the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, taking money from the overdraft facility at the central bank, borrowing money for the local. I have no problem with people borrowing to build out our capacity to export and so on. I have problems with people borrowing money to basically meet recurrent expenditure, which is things like wages and salaries and those kinds of things.
Okay, so we are talking this afternoon about the state of the economy and advocating what are some of the possibilities going forward, both to meet immediate needs, i.e. making all of the payments that a government has to make, and of course for gathering capital for investments for the future ahead. And we have Dr. Dave Seerattan, you just heard him, and we also have Dr. Vanus James. And what is your response to this, Dr. James, this thing about foregoing revenue, possibly through the TTRA, and we haven't talked about the other taxation measure that has been talked about, the property tax business, and on the same hand, attempting to spread your immediate expenditure outside of developmental purposes?
The situation Kamala finds herself in is very similar to the situation Robinson found himself in 1986, with an economy that was collapsing and a huge set of expectations from his supporters. On a scale of enthusiasm that gave the government and has given Kamala's government enough room to even change the constitution, especially if you add the Tobago votes. So there's a lot of high expectations that she has to grapple with. Her first challenge is to deal with some of the things Dave has been saying. The reason we are running into these budgetary challenges is because the economy is collapsing and the collapse continues. It hasn't been stemmed. And to stem it, you are going to have to use investment programming to stall the process and turn it around. What they were saying about the right way to use whatever resources you could raise. We're going to have to grapple with that. That requires a proper conversation with the country as to where we should be trying to push our heads. So that's the first thing. The framework for that conversation does not currently exist. Robinson didn't have it. Kamala doesn't have it now. And it's going to be a mighty challenge to whip up the political wisdom to work out how to talk to the country on that matter. What the government is doing so far is to do the old same thing that the PNM was doing, which is to hold a cabinet meeting and then hold a cabinet press conference and tell the country what you decide. But that's far removed from the kind of governance this country is going to need to turn the situation around without any dramatic increase in oil and gas prices. That's the first comment I want to make. The second thing goes back to what Robinson faced. You're going to have to, Kamala is going to find out that you have to discipline the society with respect to all those things that you promised. You can't just reopen Petrochin. That is going to be billions of dollars that would be needed to do that in any sensible way. Some coming from the local space and some coming from international investment. So that's going to be a tough call. And if the country is going to contribute some of that money, it's going to require a huge sacrifice in many other areas. So that's going to be a difficult promise for Kamala to keep. Now, in addition to that, 10% increase of income to the public servants, and keeping up with what you're hearing from Fali and his team over here in Tobago about demanding more money from Kamala. All of those things she's going to have a way to discipline, because she will not be able to afford them. And how you discipline your supporters in that way is not easy. Robinson almost lost his life trying to do that with whatever devices he could cook up. I think Kamala might be smart enough at least to observe that experience and to come quickly to the idea that you have to work out a way to talk to the country, to get the stakeholders, the primary stakeholders who just gave you office, to sit down and face the reality that now, between now and maybe the next 2 years or so, you can't really just go and hand public servants a 10% wage increase. And between now and maybe the next 2 or 3 years, you will need a lot of strategic thinking to decide what we're really going to do with petrol trend. So this is not a simple problem that she has in her hands, and the tools required to grapple with it, she doesn't have. And this is something that I am very concerned about in Trinidad and Tobago today.
Yeah, you know, Dr. James, as you were talking about Robinson, and I remember very well on the campaign trail in 1986, covering a meeting at Pigot's Corner in Belmont, the NAR got a document which it said that the PNM had developed to go to the IMF. And of course, the NAR made mass, so to speak, with that. 2 years after they got into office, Mr. IMF man had the rage of the Muslimin in the parliament. So it's a lesson that we all have to be wary of going forward. Dr. Seerattan.
Well, before you go forward there, I wanted to just clinch the point by that same point you're making there by saying, I remember, because I campaigned so heavily with NAR in Tobago and in Trinidad and Tobago to build NAR, that Robinson had the opinion that he expressed many times in my earshot, that you can't eat constitution. Kamala is going to find out that if you're going to have any serious conversation with the country, agenda number one has to be to set up the government in a way that mimics the kind of constitutional reform you really have to go after as step one. And then you work that out over time. You can't dismiss this business of needing proper arrangements to talk to the country. What we have now is not going to work with this business of press conference and all of that. All of that is good. So that gets you marks from the point of view of courage of the Prime Minister and all of that, but it will not get you the discipline you need for your supporters to have if you're going to weather this storm. So I think priority number one for Kamala is to work out in a proper conversation with people who have real understanding of these issues, how to set up arrangements in the country that will allow a sane, credible conversation with all stakeholders, especially radical labor. They got her 4 seats, don't forget.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Seerattan, a point has been raised here, which again happened on occasion on a number of governments in the past, including the PNM, the NAR, the PP, People's Partnership, etc. When you make these kinds of promises, especially when you're in a kind of coalition, and I do even consider this to be a coalition, it's a kind of association of some people looking to get into office and get certain things, especially the trade unions, as has happened in the past. I remember the NAR and that march in San Fernando down High Street and so on, when the trade unions broke away from the association with NR. It happened again in the People's Partnership government. The pressure is going to be put, it probably has started already, on the government to meet the demands of labor, and that has the potential for fallout if the government cannot meet those demands. Dr. James talked about starting at 10%, one of the, well, most ridiculous things that has been said on the campaign. Your response?
Well, Vanus is completely right that our approach to governance has to change. And the top-down approach to government, as Vanus indicated, the cabinet having a meeting and then coming and declaring to everyone what shall be done, that approach was not successful even in the best of times, and it definitely would not work in the worst of times. I think the Prime Minister has to, one of the things that neither the last government or the initial first steps of this government is doing, you have to level with the population, right? That is the main thing, because it is no good that you build up people expectations that you're going to do things in a particular way, and then inevitably, because of the objective factors on the ground, you can't deliver. That is a recipe for chaos, right? So I choose to look on the bright side, right? So what we need is a genuine tripartite type of arrangement with the government, labor, and business, right? And not something that is cooked up just before the election for the newspapers and for the media and so on. It has to be something that is genuine, that the politicians who are on the ground actually make a commitment to do that, and the powers that be in the various political parties are wedded to, right? So you have to have that genuine tripartite arrangement, and the only way you can have that genuine tripartite arrangement is if you level with the people, right? And let them know the situation. Me and Vanus, because we are economists, we know what's going on, right? Because you have that specialist knowledge. But unfortunately, the vast majority of people, even people in the professional circles and so on, don't understand. And therefore, there's a lot of misinformation out there and a lot of potential for mischief and so on, right? So you have to sit down with the people, and the people who are in the Ministry of Finance, who knows where the situation is with the country, lay it out in great detail, and then tell the people this is how we propose that we move forward, going forward in terms of the kinds of strategies we'll adopt and so on. And of course, before you do that, you have to have real conversations with your coalition partners. It's a good thing that there are the major labor interests within the coalition of interest. So you're already there, right? But I think a lot of the discussions and so on is based on hyperbole and on promises and so on that is not grounded in reality, right? But I am almost sure that behind the scenes, these people have discussed some of the issues that they will face going forward, because none of the labor unions, and definitely not Mrs. Prasad Bisasa, are foolish people. So they must know there are certain parameters within they have to operate, right? So you already have labor in the thing, and I'm sure the business will come along. If you come with you come and tell them this is exactly what the problems is. This is the options that we have. We propose that we are going to use a subset of these thing moving forward, and we are going to deal with the valid interest of labor, because I mean to say, people talk about 10%, and Vanus is even suggesting probably 10% might be not sustainable. But when you're talking about labor, you have to remember a lot of people in this country are living on 2016 salaries, right? It was the fact that the last government, the Prime Minister then chose to accept the SRC recommendation, was, to me, one of the most irresponsible piece of decision making I've seen in a long time. Because yes, these people deserve the increase, because by all objective factors and so on, but so do all the unions who are advocating for increasing salaries. And definitely the appropriate amount is not 4 and 5%. I myself would have helped the university go through a process that recommended a certain increase, right? But that increase was much higher than what we actually got or settled for. And the underlying reason for accepting those things was that we understood that there's one thing about being deserving and another thing about being able to afford, right? And the only way you could square that circle about deserving and what you could afford is if you're level with people. And not only level with people, but demonstrate by your own actions that you are willing to be part of the sacrifice that we all are going to have to make. And if you don't do that, then you have no moral authority to ask people for restraint.
Yeah.
Okay?
I heard one of the trade union leaders, who is the minister in the Ministry of Public Utilities, the TSTT trade unionist. His name slips me the moment. I heard him on a radio program a couple of days ago talking about what is negotiable and what is non-negotiable. And one of the things, two things he mentioned, the 10%, starting at the 10%, well, I suppose if you say we start at 10% and we have the flexibility to go down as well as go up, that might be a possibility, only joking. And the second one has to do with what the OWTU must be expecting, that at least the government will look again at the proposal of the union, assuming that the union may still be interested and still has its partners in tow. So that can be a really difficult bridge to cross. The unions and their needs, what they think are their legitimate needs and wants, and what the government can afford. Dr. James.
One of the things that it's not our business to advise the Prime Minister, but speaking as citizens, and I talk to a lot of people in the public service pretty much every day, and they are adamant that they need their 10% or something that settles their minds about where we're going here. And I think one of the things that Kamala should give serious consideration to, at least her Minister of Finance should think about it and propose it to her. And that is rolling back these huge, excessive doubling and two rungs of pay increases that the Prime Minister and ministers got in the last government twice, and public servants got nothing. Those are real candidates for rollback so that the country could be given an indication by the government that it is really, it's putting its money where its mouth is, so to say. It is bringing empathy, it's bringing good faith, and it is able to say, well, we're not going to live high on the hog if you can't live, as Dave is clearly clarifying. So I think that those kinds of things have to be put into the equation if you're going to get public servants to not say what you just said there, Tony, which is that this 10% is non-negotiable. Dave's point is correct. You may say it's non-negotiable, but the country may not be able to afford it. And then it is that same situation that almost cost Robinson his life in 1990 thereabouts. So we have to be extremely careful. I want to remind you of something else too. Back in 2015, you may have covered it yourself, Tony, but I went to a campaign meeting somewhere in Cocorit, Carenage, held by Rowley, when he made clear to the country that he wasn't interested in changing the rules, the constitutional arrangements. And then he ran the parliament as though he didn't even think Kamala should come in there as opposition leader. Remember? The antagonism showed. That's practical evidence of the fact that we really need to set up different ways to engage the conversation in the country about these things. Because you have a set of professors in the university, as Dave is saying, who understand both things. They need the pay increase, but they could make the judgment from their professional capabilities that the country can afford it. So they tempered their request. Now, that's not something you are going to expect in all the trade unions. So might have that attitude and that capacity to make that judgment, but don't look in OWTU for that. So yes. This is not a simple situation to face if you are Kamala. And all of it says all the voices have to be in the conversation. in order to work out where we go from here. I'm not sure I agree with Dave that this is a matter for tripartite arrangements, because what you're dealing with here, you take a place like Tobago, you take a government like the THA that is going to come with requests for X% more money, 4 billion rather than 2.5 billion and so on, that they're going to come with that same sort of thing in June here coming up. And you're going to need capabilities in the THA to engage the country in a serious conversation about where the nation is going and where Tobago is going inside of that. I do not see that capacity sitting down inside the THA that I know very well. So you're going to need a national conversation with all the players, all of us. I'm not in any of the tripartite elements that Dave is talking about, but you better want to hear the kinds of things I have to say about both constitutional reform and the way to set up the government for real conversation, and what I have to say about the way to initiate the development process in the country. If you set up the arrangements so you can't get access to those kinds of information, you're trying to run a government with a 10% tank of gas. It won't work.
Okay. By now, I don't know, Sir Charles, do we have our two other guests outside waiting just yet?
Actually, no, I have not seen them as yet, but I'm looking out for them.
Well, as soon as you see them, break into our discussion.
No problem. I definitely
let's
let
hear
you
what
know.
they have to say.
Yeah, Tony, if I may,
Sure.
before you continue, just to respond to Vanna's question about the tripartite arrangement. When I'm talking about tripartite, I suppose on the government side, I would include the THA and Fali's side and so on, and of course the Tobago Business Association and so on. So when I'm talking about the tripartite thing, is all encompassing, because obviously it would not make sense to have a national conversation, as Vanus rightly pointed out, with all the elements from Tobago. And if we want to use Tobago as our linchpin in the tourism sector, we have to have a discussion with Tobago, right? So that's to clarify that thing. So just to come back to the whole issue about the differences between reality and the promises. I think, as Valence rightly pointed out, the way Mr. Robinson sought to square the circle back in the 1980s with the problem we face was doomed to failure. One, because he didn't seek to really involve sufficient amounts of the stakeholders in the discussion. And I mean, I could understand a little bit that he needs to make a decision quick, and you don't have time for consultation and so on, right? Because the IMF is at the door, the treasury is empty. If you don't pull the trigger now, you're not going to be able to afford all the necessary thing to run the country and so on. The reason I'm talking about the tripartite arrangement is because if we had a tripartite arrangement in place, we would not now be scrambling to get consensus on some of the challenges that bedevil us. This is supposed to have been something part and parcel of the way we run the country, right? And the approach, if we don't run the country in this kind of mature way, with this kind of tripartite arrangement, in a real sense, then you get these pickup sides and you get these kinds of arrangements being hastily arranged around the electoral cycle, which is the worst possible kinds of things to do. We have to have some kind of mechanism that allows the country at large, across different political regimes, to organize in a way that plans for the long term, irrespective of who is in government at the same point in time. So look at this foolishness with respect to the Revenue Authority. We have gone through a whole host of things to bring the Revenue Authority to this point, but now we're going to backpedal. It seems as we're going to backpedal. I hope the Prime Minister finds a way to, even if we don't call it the Revenue Authority, we have an arrangement in place that does essentially what the Revenue Authority would have done. So she has spoken about upgrading and enhancing the different separate elements that collect revenue in Trinidad and Tobago. Probably that will work. I have not looked at it closely. But the main point is that the underlying point, whether it's the revenue authority or whether it is the model that the Prime Minister want to use, we have to upgrade our ability and the administrative and institutional mechanisms in place for collecting revenue, because without revenue, we are dead in the water. So, for example, this whole issue about the increase in salaries. Now, there are ways to square the circles in terms of what was promised and the reality on the ground. There are ways. Vanus will know that because he's an economist, right? Now, if we decide that we're going to, in spite of the problems we have on the ground, we're going to meet those commitments, and I think politically, Ms. Bissessa have to meet those things, the minimum of 10%. So we have to find a way to square the circle. And over the last couple of days since the election, I have been thinking about this at great lengths about how you square that circle, right? And there are ways that you could square that circle, but we do have time on this program to discuss those things. But one of the main elements of the way you're going to square that circle and be able to meet at least the 10%, right, is you have to make sure that your revenue systems are firing on all cylinders. So if we have a revenue system that is firing on all cylinders, it probably take 2 years again to get that up and running. You're closing the fiscal deficit we have now of between $6 and $10 billion by simply changing up the administrative arrangements and without increasing the marginal rate of taxation, which is something they have been talking about as well, right? But then you have to think again about how you get that approximately $1 billion recurrent. It will take you, if you give public servants writ large the 10%, right? And at that point, the country will have to make a decision about what we do with the marginal rates of taxation, right? Because I don't know the numbers as yet, but if you were able to bring everybody within the tax base who are not now paying taxes, I'm talking about businessmen, I'm talking about people who have who operate their own private business, whether they are lawyers, doctors, attorneys, or whatever. Those people, if you look at the data, the amount of taxes we collect from those self-employed people and so on, if you know the size of the sector and so on, you know we are not collecting the full amount from those agencies, right? So it may be that simply augmenting and developing our tax administration structure, you might be able to collect a couple billions more, in addition to the ones that you are missing who are escaping the system and so on. So it may be that you are able to meet that recurrent 10% additional simply by fixing the tax system without marginal increases in taxes.
Right.
But even if, Tony, let me just finish the train of thought. Even though we need to increase the marginal rate of taxation to meet that 10%, I think the country as a whole would have to sit down and say, you know what? Even though I am going to have to pay a couple of extra $100 in taxes, remember I would have gotten 10% additional. If I have to pay, if the tax rate, for example, move from, I don't know, 25%, the marginal rate of personal taxation from 25% to 3 extra points, I don't mind paying that, if the country as a whole, if everybody wins, according to borrow a slogan from the UNC, right? But that only comes from people recognizing how interconnected we are and realizing that this is our country. And independence is about making tough decisions so that we can best manage our affairs and create a future that is favorable for our children and so on. So again, that leveling with the people and fixing administrative systems in the revenue area, I think we could actually square the circle. And there are other things you could do to square the circle that Mr. Robinson would have done, like giving people bonds rather than money for their back pay, giving them land, giving them houses that we may already have in stock and so on and so forth. Right? We had to think outside the box if you want to square this in.
One element of the taxation, whatever you do with it, it cannot be regressive. It must be progressive, meaning that it must fall on those who can pay beyond what they pay now, because if it's regressive and it falls on ordinary people, that must be confusion, Dr. James. Yes?
Let me just make an observation to my friend Dave, given the eloquence with which he articulates his position there, that just from my normal practice, I engage with and consult with a lot of small businesses, not just in Tobago, but also in Trinidad. And one of the striking things you observe when you are practicing in that way is that outside of the energy sector, by and large, Trinidad and Tobago is a nation of small businesses. Now, these small businesses have a particular characteristic that I've been able to observe over the last 10 years. And that is that many times, in many years, in many seasons of the year, they borrow to pay their workers. And a big reason underlying them not keeping up with their taxes is that they have to choose between paying the taxes and not paying their workers, and ultimately having to shut their business down. So many businesses that I actually consult would say to me, well, what can I do in relation to the tax obligations that I owe? What deal can I work out with the government so that I can have room and time to pay the taxes, which are becoming a burden in this economy that is collapsing around them? Mm-hmm. I think you're going to have to be very, very thoughtful. And for that reason, I don't think this is about the ministry cooking up a strategy. This is what I mean when I say you're going to have to be talking to the stakeholders about what is possible. Because many of them employ 15 and 20 and 30 and 50 people and 100 people. And when you add that across the small business community, that's a lot of employment that you have in your hands. And if you go and pressure them now to pay up all their taxes, they're going to have to close their businesses. So these are real realities on the ground created by the collapse of our economy through bad policy by the PNM in the last 10 years. And we're going to need a sensible government to handle it.
Yeah, just to inform our listeners and remind you that we are talking about the state of the economy and really the way forward that has to be adopted by the government, of course, with implementation agreement with the trade unions, the business community. Vanus James just talked about the small business owner struggling to make payments of taxes, but having to meet them anyhow, and struggling to stay alive. You know, what has struck me in the last 10 minutes or so that we've been talking. Sorry, Sir Charles, anybody else in the room so far?
Not yet, not already. I've just sent you a message.
All right. As soon as you see somebody break into the discussion. You know, what has struck me in the last 10, 15 minutes of the chat here between Dr. James and Dr. Seerattan is that so much of this, so much of what we are talking about is political. Political in the sense, even we are talking about bending and accepting, even for the citizen who might be politically one side or the other, not willing to bend because his or her party is in power. At the other level, we talked about the trade unions already, and we're going to talk about the political parties. To be sure, as happened in '86, when the PNM went into opposition after this, 33-3 drubbing by the NAR, it rose as a political force with the Abu Bakr group and what was it called? I don't remember the name, but the protests, the level of protests rose, and 1919 came about as a result of that kind of thing. So the politics I am seeing being at the center of all of this. I don't know if you gentlemen agree with me.
May I just make a comment on that? just to help you to open the door for the erudition of Dave. One of the things I observed over the years, going all the way back to the death of Eric Williams, Chambers coming forward after that, Manning and so on, is that it matters a lot how you take power. First of all, how prepared you are to grapple with the challenges of the country, how much you understand them and can lead your troops to engage them. And whether you simply took power, as I have seen with NAR and others, whether you simply take power to get rid of the PNM, for example, and then you find yourself in a monkey pants because you've succeeded in getting rid of the PNM, deservedly so, but you didn't come armed with an adequate moral authority to say to the country, let's sit down and talk and work out our situation. That's the ultimate politics that you are really talking about. When you have a prime minister in power that has won on the expectation that he or she can fix the situation, and the situation has the configuration that we now know exists here, with a collapsed economy, collapsed oil prices, collapsed gas prices, massive deficits. This last government here, the PNM, took emergency loans a couple of months before the election, just in the cusp of the election, in order to pay recurrent expenses because they couldn't raise the revenues. The whole situation squeaks of a genuine, screams of a genuine economic collapse, and we had to be very careful that that does not translate into a political collapse because expectations are out of line with a proper understanding of how we have to handle our situation to restart our economy and put our shoulders to the wheel together to do that. If you don't have the moral authority to call the country together and the skills to know how to do it, you're going to end up in the same pool that Robinson ended up in, one of the most hated people in the country, minus Abu Bakr. Forget about the Abu Bakr part of the story. I remember when I came home from doing my PhD and going into the market in Port of Spain and just doing my one-man survey to find out how the people think about the government. And all over the market in Port of Spain, people were screaming to me that they should have killed Robinson. They didn't know I was a Tobagonian. They're just expressing their frustration in response to the question I posed. So this is Trinidad is a society that I have observed that has no tolerance for suffering. If you look in Tobago, you have patience, but not in Trinidad. And the government
I have a story. I have a story similar to your going in the market. I remember the emergency had moved from 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock or something like that. And so I'm walking around the savannah. And when I reached the street before QRC, the old casuals club that was on the corner there, fellas come from playing football and come, Fraser boy, what do you think about this? I think they should kill Robinson.
Exactly.
I was absolutely shocked because yes, we all were critical of Prime Minister Robinson, but to reach to the point that
the
we
vitriol,
dead.
the vitriol, that was uncalled for. I have a similar story as well. I was actually in St. Lucia doing my master's in economics internship, and I met some Trinidadians and the same thing, Vanus, that the people in the market were telling you, the same thing they were saying about Robinson. I shook my head because, again, they didn't understand the situation we found ourselves in, one, and two, that Robinson was doing the best that he could. That's the best that he could, right? And the best wasn't good enough, right? But in this current situation,
but
I am willing to
go on. I think Robinson's major problem to start with had to do with the association and the coalition and the failure to bring.
You have to keep your coalition together.
Yeah,
that is the rampart on which a thing will be built. So I am hoping
on the day after the election, There was a news conference called at the old Holiday Inn on Rysor Road, and we were all invited. It was a morning news conference, 10 o'clock or something like that. And when I reached the news conference, who were the people there in addition to the Mr. Robinson? He hadn't been sworn in yet as Prime Minister. Were members of the ONR Guard. And I asked one of them sitting there, well, where are the UNC members? They weren't UNC, they were whatever they were at that point. In other words, the Pandey group of the thing. And he shrugged me off, one of those persons associated with Mr. Robinson. And the collapse really started from there.
Yeah. So that, Tony, that's a lesson for Miss Prasad Bisesa. And she is old enough to remember those times. So I think if this government is going to succeed, and we have to hope that it succeeds, because when government succeeds, the people succeed. And what absolutely must take precedent is to maintain the integrity of the coalition. As you rightly said, and in this political configuration, the UNC could govern on its own in terms of the arithmetic. But in terms of the algebra, as you rightly said, the beginning of the end started so early on in the term. And if people think that they could dispense with Labour and dispense with the other people who are not core to the UNC, I think that will be the beginning of the end. Because the reality is, for the challenges that lie ahead, you need support. You have to have an airtight arrangement within your own political grouping to push some of these difficult things through. So I think one of the key planks on which the success of this government will be built is to maintain the integrity of the coalition, unlike what happened in 1986 and so on. So that's one. The second thing is that politically, Ms. Prasad Bisesa cannot not meet the minimum 10% that she promised. So that is sacrosanct, right? Irrespective of all the problems that we are going to face, she has to meet that 10%. All of the other things like the refining thing could be massaged, but that fundamental thing about the 10% has to come true. And therefore, if that is the case, then forget about everything else. We have to be laser focused on how we square that circle. So we have to know how we're going to raise the money in a sustainable way to meet the back way, right? That's going to be anywhere between $6 and $10 billion. And then we have to find a way. The more difficult challenge will be to find a way to meet the recurrent expenditure, which is about $1 billion more in terms of salaries and so on, right? Now, the $6 to $10 billion is the easier of the challenge we face, because there are numerous things they could do, which include selling off certain state assets and so on to raise the money, right? The more difficult thing is to how do we, as Trinidad and Tobago, in a relatively depressed economic cycle, sustain an additional $1 billion on our recurrent expenditure. Now, I often tell people, the economy is like a living thing, you know. Every part of it that you change or you adjust is going to impact on something, no matter how far removed from that area that you think. So the positive thing about the 10% increase for public servants is that aggregate expenditure is going to improve. Because who are the people buying goods in these various places, these small businesses that Vanus talk about and so on? Who are these people? They come from outside the country. They're our people. So 10% additional for public servants is going to help those people, right? But we have to figure out how we deal with the sustainability issues, because Vanus know that because of our high import intensity, every dollar you spend, a certain percentage goes into imports, which harms the balance of payments, which is ultimately reflected in demand for foreign exchange. And we already know how fraught our foreign exchange thing is, right? So with that additional 10%, we have to find a way in which we siphon off that additional liquidity into something that can be stored up and not go directly into demand for foreign exchange, right? And there are ways, if you're a central banker, you know how to do these things, right? So those two realities about keeping the coalition together and paying that 10%, those are the non-negotiable things. And once you know that, then you have to find a way to square the circle. And there are ways of squaring the circle in terms of the back pay and in terms of the additional $1 billion. But a key part of making that sustainable is making sure our revenue system is firing on all cylinders. And then on the foreign exchange side, the only way we are going to solve our foreign exchange constraint problem is if we start earning more money on the external side. And where is that money going to come from? Right? Even if we fix the energy sector and all of a sudden we have 4 billion cubic feet of gas, that is approximately what we need for our industries and so on. And the energy sector start to improve. We are not going to get to the Holocaust days of 2005 when oil was $147 a barrel and we were earning orders of money on the foreign exchange side. So even with that thing in, we still need additional sources of foreign exchange to deal with the foreign exchange shortage. So irrespective of whether we can fix the energy sector now or 5 years in the future, we still need to do what we are currently trying to do on the diversification side, primarily in the tourism sector.
Let me
Right.
ask
So
a
there's
question.
the outlines of our basic strategy that one could use to get us out of this difficult situation.
At this point, I know Dr. James wants to say something, but
Yeah.
at this point, but you better say it before I intervene with another question.
Well,
Go
I
ahead.
want to call on you because you would remember, taking up an element of what Dave was talking about. You would remember nobody trusted Robinson's bonds.
Yes.
As soon as those bonds were issued, people tried to cash them out.
Yeah.
You remember that?
Yes.
And
Yes.
Vanus, nothing wrong with that. You could cash it out, but then you have to have a mechanism on the banking side to manage the liquidity that comes from that.
The point I think you have to remember here is that what you have is a situation in which there is deep distrust in whatever the government is doing. And there are signs right now that the government has to pay attention to. You won on a very low voter turnout, which expresses the dissatisfaction of half the country, the PNM, within the PNM itself, and a very low voter turnout, below 50% in Tobago, which expresses deep dissatisfaction with the state of the economy in Tobago. And that's the platform on which you win. That's why I asked Tony if he remembered the distrust that emerged once Robinson took power. This was distrust that was seething, that led to the victory of the narrative. It was distrust by PNM people, half the country.
Yeah, but Vanus, the problem was that when Robinson took power, he didn't carry the base, the whatever they were called that time, with him. So yes, you will have that natural distrust from the PNM base. But if you also have a certain level of fracturing of your own support base, then you are doomed to fail.
Yeah, but my point to you is that it's in the real point I'm trying to make is you look carefully and you will see it's in the east-west corridor that Robinson got himself into trouble. It's not Robinson. I mean, the fallout was expressed through what Pandey and his team did in the sense of breaking up the government and moving to form Club 88 and so on, all of that. But the real reason Robinson couldn't survive is that you combine the high expectations of narrow supporters with the deep skepticism of the PNM people who wanted Robinson to succeed because they didn't like what the PNM was doing. I remember campaigning up and down in the East-West corridor and hearing people telling me that. And the point I'm making is when you came to the point of cooking up the solutions, you had no way to talk to the country. You want a conversation with the country to do what the things you are talking about there, Dave. But you have no way now to talk to the country. And you're doing it on a platform of deep distrust. So if you go now, for example, and you raise the marginal tax rate, that distrust, how do you grapple with it? If you don't conversation.
But
are
Vanus,
going
you
to be-
would have
you're
had
gonna
given
be in
people a
trouble.
10% increase first. So people, you see, you should know, right, that sometimes it's not what you do so much that matters, is how you do it, right? And a lot of the success, the potential for success of this is going to be based on Miss Kamala Prasad Bisesar's personality and how she deals with people, because it's fundamentally about communication.
Right, right. And she has to undergo a transformation, undoubtedly. And she
Yeah.
admits that herself, that she did quite a lot of wrong, things that did not contribute to the whole the
Yeah.
last time around. I said on another program, perhaps she's older, she's more experienced, she has spent 10 years in opposition, which must not be a nice place to be, and so on. So all
But
of
not
that
only
has
that, I think her personality is more consistent with reaching out, with trying to build bridges and so on, in the
right.
way that Robinson and probably Prime Minister Rowley wasn't.
Right. So
So
we shall see that. But I want to enter an issue here,
But
which
Tony,
is
before you run along, permit me just to make one observation to you
sure.
and to Dave. The platform for the conversation does not now exist. It's a technical issue. This is a design issue she is grappling with. She has a government design that doesn't allow for any conversation with the country. That's why she is already governing just the way Rowley governed. If she is not clever enough to allow for all the voices, your voice, Dave's voice, my voice, other voices, to come into the conversation, to advise, caution, calm, wisdom, structure, and so on, it is going to blow up. Trinidad has no patience with suffering.
Just let me ask this question of both of you, two economists. One issue that has plagued Trinidad and Tobago, and not Trinidad and Tobago alone, but really the whole Caribbean, the whole New World, if you, as Lloyd Besser used to say, is this business of diversification, which goes back decades post colonialism, and having to depend on ourselves to go forward. It is nothing new. It is nothing esoteric. It is nothing that requires big scientific, perhaps in application, but scientific understanding. So that if you have one source of income, sooner or later you're going to get in trouble and you need other sources of income. And my question is, why have our politicians, political parties, governments, and not only Trinidad and Tobago, but right through the Caribbean? Tourism is now dependent, removed from or succeeded bananas and in some places, etc., etc. What it is that they have not learned is that they have to do these things. You want to start, Vanus?
Yeah, well, there are certain. Well, let's put it this way. First of all, if you're going to diversify, you have to do what Dave is talking about. You have to be able to feed the horse while you're diversifying, because it's not prepared to starve. So that's a big issue, and that's what we were discussing for virtually the last hour. And to work out how to feed the horse, you run up into the same basic situation that you have to address when you want to address the question of diversification. The first underlying issue with diversification is that you have to, the economy, the people of the country have to work out where our comparative advantages lie, other than oil and gas. We have some there, a lot of it endowed by nature, and the high marginal product of labor inside that sector. But that's not the only sector in which we have potential for comparative advantage. We could do it if you look, we have the data we're studying right now in the region. You have St. Kitts Nevis, they're making a lot of progress in that direction and moving in the right direction. They've held the conversations inside the society, and they've looked carefully at what's going on in the Bahamas, in Cayman, and in Bermuda. Those are the other three countries that are doing well enough to say they are exploiting their comparative advantage. And in all 4 cases, what they are investing in is in what I call the capital services sector. In the case of St. Kitts Nevis, it's exportable education. Now, I want to just insert the point that in 2010-11, Kamala stumbled on the right answer when she started talking about exporting healthcare services through the Couva Children's Hospital arrangement. That's the direction in which she was going. And Manning also stumbled on the right direction when he moved in the direction of financial services, although he didn't know how to do it. But if you look in St. Kitts Nevis, it's education services that they are building the conglomerates around to export, tertiary education services. Real advantage lies there. And you back that up with some of the citizen by investment financing mechanisms and so on to bring foreign investment in and foreign capital in alongside the foreign investment that you are bringing in to cook up the tertiary education programs. They have 4 consortia, including the open UWI system, as part of that effort. If you look in the Bahamas, over the last 25 years, they have moved in the direction of exporting high quality financial services, and they're doing a pretty good job of it. It has doubled their GDP per capita to about 31,000 US per person now. And what they're exporting there, legal services, accounting services, portfolio design services, all of those kinds of things. That's what they're doing. Now, we have a lot of evidence that it works in the case of Cayman and Bermuda. We've run all those models, and they are beating the US and the North Atlantic countries generally at the game of development. The Cayman produces about 21,000 US dollars per person more than the US today, and Bermuda about 37,000 more than the US. So we have a broad sense of the direction in which we have to go. But you can't push the country in that direction unless you set up the discussion in the country so all the voices could be heard. You need to hear what Dave has to say. There's a whole constituency in the country that would be interested in his observations. Yeah. We need to hear what you have to say, and so on. So that
James, what I want to intervene here to say is that some of our political leaders, some of our prime ministers across the Caribbean understands that they have to diversify, but they have not attempted to do so in any significant way. Let's look at the case of Prime Minister Rowley. He established the EDAB, the other group, what was it called? Something, so on. And then he just
board and all that.
Yes, and he simply walked away from it.
No, but
so I am saying that is a kind of ignoring of what they know or should know.
That's what
I don't think that is a proper characterization. Every government in the region has attempted diversification. The question is the level of success they have had with it, and the level of success is directly determined by the amount of resources you put behind those efforts, and secondly, the incentive structure that you have in the country from the policy regime that you have in place. So,
and therefore, you're agreeing with me that they know what should be done, but they don't do it.
Because there are political reasons why they wouldn't do it. So, for example, let me give you a question.
Hold on, Dave. Let me just express the observation that I do not agree that they know what to do.
Okay. Agreed. They may very well not, right? But part of the problem is the amount of resources they devote, financial resources as well as human resources, to those diversification efforts. And in the case of tourism in Trinidad and Tobago, if you look at the amount of capital expenditure in the PSIP devoted to simply tourism, it is not enough, right? That's one. And the second thing is the incentive structure. So if I'm a person and I have $100,000 US, why would I use that $100,000 to invest in some of the things in Tobago, Vanus, for example, doing some indigenous art and craft and chocolates? I'd see you have some good foodie scene in Tobago, as a matter of fact. Why would you do that? And you're earning, even if you're successful, you're return on investment is about 10%. And if I take the same 100,000 US dollars and buy a container of stuff from China, right? In less than 6 months, I earn in about 50, 60%. Why would I bother to go and invest in something that is more sustainable and is going to earn for, and be a net foreign exchange earner for the country, right? So that is just one example.
And you
but
know, that's a point that has been made to me by the economist, the Trinidadian economist from the CDB, that if you make it easy for the importers to live, why should they be, engage themselves in difficult taxing matters?
And Tony, the problem is the importers have a huge political clout, right? So again, the incentive structure, there is a direct line between people who have political influence and the incentive structure that we have in Trinidad and Tobago, right? So unless we change up that, we are always going to be import dependent. So some leader have to have the courage to pivot, bell the cat, and actually make serious changes, which you're going to get serious pushback. These people who, you remember, these people who are in this business have a vested interest. They have a lot of resources, right? So you have to understand the political culture and things. So for for a political leader, prime minister, to make that change, he or she has to have very strong political backing from the people on the ground to be able to push through that kind of thing. So that's why I'm saying in Kamala's case, she have at all costs to maintain the integrity of her coalition, because the kind of difficult decision she's going to have to make, she have virtually no chance of success without that thing. That is why the next thing that flows from that is that she have to fulfill that 10% pay increase. And therefore, however difficult it is, we have to square that circle about the 10% increase in a way that does not destabilize the economy further, right? And what I'm saying is there are ways, we can't cover everything on this program, but there are ways that you could do that. But everything hinges on political stability and convincing people on the other side that this is in our best long-term interest. And the only way you could do that is if the political leader have the nous, have the presence, the personality to convince people that she is genuine, and that the way we have the strategies we have outlined is something that is actually viable, right? And there's a lot of work.
Right.
But
And the reality, before Dr. James responds, the reality of that is that she did not do very well the last time. And there are people, especially in the labor movement, if we remember, within 6 months, there were people like David Ambala and so on who were raising hell.
On this occasion, Tony, she has one term because of her age.
Yeah.
Right? And when you're not interested in re-election, you are freer
to do what you have
to do the right thing.
Yeah.
In government and in politics, knowledge is not the brilliance of the individual mind, the prime minister's mind, or anything like that. It is not what Kamala knows as a scientist or as a politician that matters. It's the flow of information from the constituency, from all the citizenry, that defines what we will think of as knowledge and relevant knowledge. Political knowledge and good policy-based knowledge is about that flow of information. I took the time to go to the Cayman Islands and study the information systems underlying the decision-making processes that got them success in the financial services industry. And what I observed is completely missing in the Caribbean space outside of Cayman and maybe Bermuda. If you want to get, if there are 10 people like Dave in the University of the West Indies that has good information and wants to share that information with Kamala, if they don't have some inside connection They catch hell to share that information. And it's worse if you are people from outside of any inside connection who may be geniuses and big money investors, but have no channels of connection. That's the challenge that you have to grapple with when you're talking about a government knowing what to do. And when you're looking at all Caribbean governments, I've worked in all of them, including in Cayman, by the way. I could tell you, Jamaica has no channels through which any serious information could get to the Prime Minister. They're working on a 10% tank. It cannot work to say that the Prime Minister should this and the Prime Minister should that, when the Prime Minister does not have access to the channels to determine what makes sense to do. And there's a political side to that. It doesn't translate simply to information flow. It also translates to votes in the lawmaking process, so that the parliament is rigged up in a way that allows the information to translate into law that ring fences what the cabinet could do. It's that ring fencing of what the cabinet could do that constitutes real knowledge in the hands of the Prime Minister. She is going to be working here with a massive information deficit if she's trying to operate this system. She has to set up, deliberately set up, wherever she get the information from, proper channels of information flow to her and the cabinet. Let me give you one last illustration of that. Take this budgetary debacle that we are going to find ourselves in as a society. She's going to have to rely on the minister and the public servants. All the information that people like Dave and myself have would not be involved in that conversation. They will not know it. The public service is not sufficient to grapple with this. You still have to hear what the foreign investors have to say. You have no channels for that because it will look like public corruption or interference. You have no way to know what diaspora scholars think. You have no way to know what diaspora investors think. In the case of a place like the THA, they're completely closed. They don't even know what the government of Trinidad and Tobago wants. This system is rigged up so that, as Section 75(1) of the Constitution says, cabinet is responsible, and they're responsible without regard to the information flow to them. So you're working with a system of in which the governments are fundamentally ignorant. They cannot be informed in the context of authoritarian governance arrangements such as we have. And that's why I disagree that they know. We're doing a piece of research in the Eastern Caribbean Day, exploring the comparative advantages of the countries there. The models we are running have never been run by any of the governments. They've never been run anywhere in the region at any time. This is work we're bringing in from the UN to help the countries to know. And it's been now 4 months since we've generated these pieces of data. And we have no channels to use, even as UN institutions, to go to the country and say, our research shows this. Our research shows that. Those channels do not exist for us inside the UN, and they don't exist for ordinary citizens inside the country. You can't even know what investors are willing to put in. We've never done a capital expenditure survey in Trinidad and Tobago, Dave. You can't know what the businesses want to invest. We just don't know.
And the unfortunate thing is that the cabinet is an echo chamber. And even within the cabinet, there's smaller echo chambers, probably in the inner circles of the Prime Minister and so on. So even if you think there are no sufficient information flows coming to the cabinet because it's an echo chamber, it gets even worse when you get closer to the center, to the Prime Minister and his or her circle and so on. And I don't know if it is because this is not something that's only a problem for Trinidad and Tobago.
No,
it's not only a problem in Trinidad and Tobago. So there's a deficit of information flows to leaders all over the world, right? But what will be interesting, I'm not interested in diagnosing the problem again, is the solution. So Vanus, you seem to have some information in terms of how that information deficit could be corrected in Bermuda and Cayman Islands. I think it will be very useful at least to get it out there into the netherworld web, and hopefully it lands on somebody that's and we could start making a real change, because I never thought about that part of it. But the lack of inflation flow is directly related to the incentive structure that we have in place. And that is directly related to the kinds of problems we have.
That's correct.
All right, so we are talking, and we have two economists working overtime because we were expecting two other fellas. When you see those fellas, you have to charge them a fee for making overtime. Yeah, we're talking about the difficulties of the economy going forward, and we saw elements of politics very much involved in it, elements of communications. Both of you have talked about the need for interaction and communicating in a serious kind of way with the population, not the kind of communication that I saw when Dr. Rowley was Prime Minister. He went here, there, and everywhere, and he talked down to everybody. Sometimes people are asking a question, he not even listening. He take over, everything, and so on. I don't know what the situation is with the House of Assembly in Tobago. I hear the Chief Secretary, and not so much what he says, but I find his tone is quite disturbing in that kind of respect. He seems to know everything. He has everything under control, and he wants to damn everybody around him. Tobago is coming up politically, in a year's time, Dr. James, with the THA elections. I don't know if sufficient time has passed to bring some political information to the House of Assembly, occupied now by the Tobago People's Party?
Not much. I mean, it's closed government, just like the government here. You would remember, Tony, when Comembert would present the budget, he would describe people like Dave and Roger Hussein and myself as uninformed commentators. Because he has truckloads of that. This is what is correct about Dave's statement, that you're making decisions in a bubble. You really have no way to assess, and the THA is the worst example of that in the whole Caribbean. I live here in Tobago, and I can tell you, the most autocratic and authoritarian government in the entire Caribbean system, more so than even cabinet in Trinidad, is the Executive Council in Tobago. There is absolutely no basis on which they have to listen to what anybody has to say. And that's why the economy in Tobago has collapsed right alongside that of Trinidad and Tobago over the last 9 years. So they will not learn. The only time politicians learn is when what happened to Kamala and to Rowley happens again. When the population gets angry enough to say they close their ears to one party and they're just going to kick them out no matter what. And even if the turnout is low, those who go are bent on getting rid of the government. That's the only time governments in the Caribbean can hear the people. That's why most governments fall in a landslide.
Yeah. Dave Seerattan, your closing comments.
My closing comments would be the doom and gloom that currently pervades the country with respect to our economic prospects. Although it is difficult, it is not something we that we have gone through those things in the past. The countries that succeed are the countries who manage the situation, manage the resources in an effective way. And that's what I often tell my students, the most important determinant of development is not natural resource, not resources in the form of oil and gas and cobalt and uranium and those kinds of things, is the extent to which you could release the full potential of the people within the country. And the only way that could be done is if you have a governance arrangement that is able to harness all the talent that we have in this country towards a single purpose. And once you could find a leader that could harness that tremendous potential we have in this Twin Island Republic, we are going to be flying, right? And there are, even though we have very, very difficult road to travel ahead, if we know if we could focus on the things that are important, communicate that effectively to the people outside, and then have enough consensus within the elites and within the government circles to push through some of the policies that we need to, then we will be in a good place in the future.
Your final comment, Dr. James?
Well, if I were able to tell the Prime Minister one thing, what I would do is say all the record that we have from all your predecessors from Eric Williams to now would tell you that you need to be smart enough to set up a proper conversation with your country. You need to be able to have information flowing from all corners of the country. There's a spatial side, the communities have things to tell you. Inside Trinidad, the communities up and down the country where you won your election, the communities inside Tobago, all parts of the country, the professionals in the university, you need to set up a proper conversation with your citizens as a matter of urgency. And if you do, you have a real chance to grapple with the solutions Dave is talking about. And if you don't, you are running a real risk of the Robinsonian outcomes.
Dr. Vanus James and Dr. Dave Seerattan, thank you very much for talking today about the situation that we face. And I think both economists are reserving a measure of hope and possibility for the country if politically the right things are done to allow engagement with the entire society. So thank you again for being with us this afternoon, and our listeners and viewers. And so we come back, we don't come on Fridays, so we come back on Monday with another program. Thanks again. Chalo.
Good to talk with you, Dave.
All right, okay, take care.
Thank you very much, Tony, and thank you very much to your guests, the inside of the Drive Time Exchange.
Wherever it goes, I go in with it. Tell them I go in with it. I go sail when the tide is flat. I go sail when the tide is neat. You see, going to hell and back. I go make the trip. I'm bound to make the trip. I'm sailing with the boat, sink or float. I'm sailing with the boat. I'm sailing with the boat, sink or float, I'm sailing with the boat.